The night Han Seok walked into Café Noir, every person in that room felt it. The air shifted, conversations died, spoons stopped stirring. Even the background music seemed to lower itself out of respect or fear. Because when the most dangerous man in the city walks into a room, you do one of two things. You bow your head, or you pray he doesn't notice you. Saniya Daniels did neither. She looked up from the counter, clocked him once, tattoos, tailored suit, the kind of jaw that belonged on a movie screen, and went straight back to wiping down the counter. Just like that. Han Seok had toppled businesses. He had made generals kneel. He had walked into rooms where armed men parted like water just to let him through. In his entire life, not one person had ever looked at him and simply looked away. Until her. And what happened next set off a chain of events that nobody in that cafe, nobody in that entire city, could have predicted. He tried to buy her. She handed his money back without blinking. He tried to break her. She didn't crack. He took everything he thought she needed, and she still refused to bow. So Han Seok did something he had never done for any person alive. He stayed. He watched. He waited. And slowly, without permission, without a plan, this cold, ruthless, feared man started to feel something he had no weapon against. But here is the part. Nobody tells you about falling in love with a man like Han Seok. It never comes without a price. What happens when the most dangerous man in the city decides he wants you, and won't stop until he has you? Stay, because this story is only just beginning. Make sure to subscribe if you are new here, so you don't miss out on more amazing story. It was 11:43 at night when Han Seok walked into Café Noir. The two men at the corner table paid their bill without being asked and left within 30 seconds. The young couple by the window suddenly found urgent reasons to look at their phones. Even the barista, a college kid who prided himself on being unshakable, took one look at the men filing through the door and quietly moved to the far end of the counter. Han Seok didn't notice any of it. He never did. People clearing rooms for him had stopped being remarkable years ago. He chose a table near the back, unbuttoned his jacket, and sat down. The underworld meeting he'd just left had run 3 hours too long and ended with two men considerably poorer and one man considerably more afraid. He wanted coffee. Quiet, nothing else. That was before he saw her. Saniya Daniels came out of the kitchen carrying a tray like she was the only person in the world with somewhere to be. She moved with a kind of unhurried confidence that immediately caught his attention, not performing for anyone, not shrinking for anyone, just existing in her own orbit, completely unbothered by the world around her. Han Seok watched her set down 2 cups at a table, say something that made an elderly customer laugh, and then turn toward him with her notepad already open. "What can I get you?" No pause, no double take, no reaction whatsoever to the tattoos climbing his neck or the 2 large men positioned silently behind him. "Coffee," he said, "black." She wrote it down and walked away. Han Seok leaned back in his chair, and for the first time all evening felt something that wasn't irritation. When she brought the coffee, he tried a smile, the kind that had historically caused a certain category of problems for a certain category of women. Saniya placed the cup down, asked if he needed anything else, and when he opened his mouth to say something smooth, she had already turned and walked back toward the counter. He tried again when she came to refill his cup, a comment about how late she worked, a question about whether she was always this serious. She answered both with the bare minimum of words and 0 eye contact, like he was a mild inconvenience she was professionally obligated to tolerate. Han Seok was not used to being tolerated. He was not used to being processed like background noise by a woman in a cafe apron who smelled like vanilla and clearly had no idea, or no interest, in who he was. By the time he stood to leave, something had shifted in him from curiosity to something more deliberate. He walked to the counter slowly. Saniya was wiping down the surface and glanced up when he stopped in front of her. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded stack of bills, and placed them on the counter between them. Enough money to make most people in this city forget their own name. He leaned forward slightly, Come with me. The cafe went still. Saniya looked down at the money, a long, unhurried look. Then she looked up at him directly, steadily, without a single trace of fear or flattery in her eyes. She slid the money back across the counter. I'm not on the menu. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Han Seok had heard all night. His bodyguards shifted. Every remaining person in the cafe stopped breathing. And nobody could see what was written on Han Seok's face. Han Seok did not slam the cafe door on his way out. That was the thing about a man who had operated in the underworld long enough. Rage didn't always look like noise. Sometimes it looked like a perfectly controlled walk to a waiting car, a door closed with quiet precision, and two bodyguards wise enough to say absolutely nothing for the entire ride. He waited until they were moving before he called Kang. I need a full background on a woman, waitress at Café Noir on Linden Street. His voice was even, almost pleasant, the kind of tone that made Kang straighten up on the other end of the line because he had worked for Han Seok long enough to know that pleasant was the most dangerous setting. Find out who she is, find out what she loves, find out what she fears. A pause. By morning. By morning. He hung up and watched the city move past the window in streaks of light. Back inside Café Noir, the tension dissolved the moment the black car pulled away from the curb. Conversations resumed. The barista exhaled loud enough to be embarrassing, and Saniya Daniels finished wiping down the counter, picked up the money Han Seok had left behind, which he had not taken back, and dropped it in the staff tip jar without ceremony. Talu appeared at her elbow within seconds. What was that? A customer with too much money, and too high an opinion of himself. Saniya, Talu's voice dropped. He had bodyguards. Rich men usually do. She moved to the next table and started stacking cups. He'll get over it. Talu pulled out her phone and started typing. Saniya ignored her until she heard the sharp inhale, the specific kind that meant something had gone wrong. What? Talu turned the screen around slowly. It was a news article. The photo was grainy but unmistakable, the same sharp jaw, the same neck tattoos, the same eyes that had stared across the counter less than 20 minutes ago. The headline above the photo did not require much reading. Saniya looked at the screen for a moment. Then she looked at Talu. Then she picked up her cloth and moved to the next table. Saniya, I have 4 more tables to clean before close. Talu stared at her. Did you just read what I showed you? I did. And I have 4 more tables to clean. Kang's file arrived at 6:19 in the morning. Han Seok was already awake. He rarely slept well after meetings that required the kind of conversations those meetings required. He sat at his desk in a gray shirt, reading glasses on, coffee untouched, and opened the document without expression. Saniya Daniels, 26, no living parents, no property, no savings to speak of, currently working double shifts at Café Noir 6 days a week. Every spare cent traced to a single recurring payment, a private cardiac unit at St. Emmanuel's Hospital. He turned the page. Kane Daniels, 19 years old, younger brother, congenital heart disease, awaiting surgery, funding gap significant. Han Seok sat back in his chair and read the file again from the beginning, slowly this time. By the 3rd read, he wasn't seeing words anymore, he was seeing architecture, structure, the particular shape of a person's life that told you exactly where they would break. He set the file down on the desk. A slow smile crossed his face, not warm, not cruel, just deeply, quietly satisfied. He reached for his phone. Find out who owns Café Noir. 2 weeks passed, and Café Noir went back to being exactly what it had always been. The regulars returned. The corner couple came back with their phones and their flat whites. The elderly man by the window resumed his Tuesday crosswords, and Saniya Daniels showed up every morning 6 minutes before her shift, tied her apron with the same efficient knot, and moved through the cafe like the conversation with Han Seok had been nothing more than a brief interruption in an otherwise unremarkable evening. Talu watched her carefully for those 2 weeks and said nothing, mostly because there was nothing to say to a woman who had already decided she wasn't afraid. Then came Thursday morning. Mr. Beek, the cafe owner, called the staff together before opening. He stood at the front of the room with his hands clasped and the particular expression of a man who had already made a decision and was only now working up the courage to announce it. The cafe, he said, had been sold. The transaction was complete. The new owner would be taking over with immediate effect and had asked to be introduced to the staff personally this morning. The door opened. The sound that moved through the room was not quite a gasp and not quite silence. It was something in between, the specific noise people make when their body reacts before their mind has finished processing. 2 staff members actually stepped backward. The barista knocked over a cup. Talu's hand found Saniya's arm and gripped it with the quiet desperation of someone grabbing a railing on a tilting ship. Han Seok walked in like he had always owned the place, because now he did. He was unhurried, suit dark, expression neutral, presence filling the room the way it always did, not loudly, just completely. He stood beside Mr. Beek and let his eyes move slowly across the assembled staff, taking inventory, until they landed on Saniya. He smiled, not wide, not warm, just a calm, deeply satisfied curve of the mouth that said everything he wasn't saying out loud. Saniya looked back at him and said nothing. The meeting was brief. Mr. Beek thanked the staff for their years of service, wished everyone well, and shook Han Seok's hand with the relieved energy of a man who had been made an offer he had no interest in refusing. Han Seok said he intended to keep all current staff and that operations would continue as normal. He said it pleasantly. He looked at Saniya once more when he said it. Afterward, when Han Seok moved to the far end of the room to speak quietly with Mr. Beek, Talu pulled Saniya into the kitchen by the elbow. "You need to apologize to him." Her voice was low and urgent. "Today, right now." "For what?" "For what?" Talu stopped and pressed her fingers to her temple. "Saniya, he bought the cafe. He is your boss. He can fire you today and there is nothing you can do about it." She lowered her voice further. "Kane needs that surgery. You need this job, please." Saniya was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen window, she could see Han Seok standing with his hands in his pockets, listening to Mr. Beek, completely at ease. The most powerful man in the room pretending to be just a businessman. Every inch of him radiating the quiet arrogance of someone who had already won. She untied her apron and retied it, slowly, deliberately. Then she lifted her chin, pushed through the kitchen door, and walked toward him. The room went still. She stopped directly behind him and tapped his shoulder. Han Seok turned around. Saniya looked up at him with the same steady, unbothered eyes she had used to slide his money back across the counter 2 weeks ago. Up close she was shorter than she appeared from a distance, but somehow that made the stillness in her posture more remarkable, not less. She wasn't bracing herself. She wasn't performing courage. She was simply standing there, completely at ease, like this conversation was already decided. "I know what you're doing," she said. Her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear it. "You bought this place to make a point. I understand that." She held his gaze without blinking. "But I want you to know that I know, and I'm not impressed." Han Seok said nothing. "If you're planning to fire me, go ahead. I'll find another job." She said it the way people state the weather, factual, emotionless, utterly without drama. "But if you're keeping me on because you think eventually I'll come around and give you whatever it is you think you're owed, I won't. That's not going to happen." She waited exactly 1 beat to see if he wanted to respond. He didn't, couldn't, was closer to the truth, and that had not happened to Han Seok in longer than he could remember. "Enjoy your cafe," Saniya said. She turned, walked back to her station, and began preparing for the morning rush with the focused efficiency of someone who had already moved on. Han Seok stood exactly where she had left him for 3 full seconds. Behind him, Kang was very carefully looking at the wall. Mr. Beek had developed a sudden intense interest in his own shoes. The rest of the staff had collectively stopped existing as a survival strategy. He buttoned his jacket, walked out without a word. He came back that evening. Same table, same chair, same black coffee. He sat with his phone face down on the table and said nothing to anyone, and the staff responded to his presence the way small animals respond to something large entering their habitat, by becoming extremely still and hopping for the best. Saniya refilled his cup without being asked, and without making eye contact. He came back the next evening, and the one after that, and the one after that. Always the same time, always the same order, always watching the room with that particular quality of attention that felt less like relaxation and more like study. His men waited outside. He sat alone. And every evening, Saniya moved around the cafe doing her job, serving her tables, laughing with customers, and treating Han Seok's presence with the same energy she gave the furniture, acknowledged only when necessary, otherwise completely unremarkable. It was driving him quietly out of his mind. He had expected her to crack within the first week. People always cracked. It was simply a matter of applied pressure and patience. But Saniya Daniels operated outside the normal rules of pressure. Every evening he sat in that cafe, and every evening he left with nothing but a refilled cup and more questions than he'd arrived with. He stayed later on Friday. When Saniya's shift ended, she came out of the front door, bag on her shoulder, and turned left down the street, on foot, at nearly midnight, without hesitation. Han Seok watched from his car for a moment before nodding to his driver. They rolled up slowly beside her. He lowered the window. "Get in." Saniya didn't look at him, didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge the car in any way. Han Seok looked at his driver. The driver said nothing. They followed her at walking pace all the way down the street, and nobody noticed the black SUV idling quietly at the far end of the block, watching all of it. It became a routine nobody could explain, and nobody dared question. Every night after Saniya's shift, Han Seok's car would ease out of its parking spot and roll alongside her at walking pace down Linden Street. Saniya would walk. Han Seok would follow. Neither of them would speak. After 3 blocks, she would turn into her neighborhood, and Han Seok would watch until she disappeared from view before telling his driver to go. Kang rode along in silence for the first 4 nights. On the 5th, he cleared his throat carefully and said, "Boss, we have a shipment review tomorrow and 2 territory meetings that got pushed from last week." "I know." Kang nodded slowly and looked back out the window. The men said nothing after that, but the looks they exchanged behind Han Seok's back spoke entire conversations. Then came the rain. It arrived on a Wednesday without warning, the heavy, relentless kind that turned Linden Street into a mirror of blurred lights and made sensible people run for cover. Han Seok sat in the warm car and watched the cafe door, privately certain that tonight would be the night. Nobody walked home in this. Nobody with any options chose wet shoes over a dry car. The cafe door opened. Saniya came out, reached into her bag, and opened a small umbrella with the calm efficiency of someone who had planned for exactly this. She turned left and started walking. Han Seok stared. Then he laughed. It came out suddenly and completely. A real laugh, unguarded and unpracticed, the kind that surprised even him. In the front seat, his driver and Kang exchanged a look of pure astonishment. In 11 years working for Han Seok, Kang had heard that sound exactly once before. They followed her through the rain. She confronted him the next afternoon. She waited until the cafe had emptied slightly, walked directly to his table, and stood across from him with her arms folded and her head tilted at the angle he was beginning to recognize as her version of loaded patience. "Don't you have a criminal empire to run?" Han Seok looked up from his phone. "I'm serious. Shipments, territories, rival gangs, surely something somewhere needs your attention." She gestured vaguely at the window. "Why are you stalking a waitress every night?" He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee and took a slow, deliberate sip. Saniya exhaled through her nose, shook her head, and went back to work. But that night she got in the car. No announcement. No explanation. She simply came out of the cafe, walked to where he was parked, and opened the passenger door. Han Seok said nothing. His driver said nothing. They drove in silence for 3 full minutes before Saniya spoke, not to answer any of the questions he had never quite managed to ask, but because she had apparently decided something on her own terms. "I'm cold to men who approach me," she said, eyes on the window. "Not because I'm rude, because every single one of them was only ever interested in one thing, a beat. They see the way I look and they think that's an invitation. It never stops, so I stopped engaging." She paused. "That's all it is." Han Seok listened without interrupting, without filling the silence when she finished. Something moved behind his eyes, quiet and unannounced, the way important things tend to shift before anyone notices they have. He pulled up near her building. She gathered her bag. "Thank you," she said quietly. Then she was gone. Han Seok sat without moving for a long moment. Then his phone rang. Kang's voice was careful. "Boss, someone's been watching the cafe, a rival crew." A short pause. "They've clocked the girl." Han Seok's jaw tightened slowly, his eyes finding the corner of the street on instinct, and there it was. A black SUV, engine idling, parked just far enough away to be easy to miss. Inside her apartment, Saniya dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes, and had no idea at all. Han Seok was already outside the cafe when her shift ended. Not parked at a distance this time. Right at the entrance, window down, engine running, and something in his expression made Tolu physically step back when she saw it from inside. Saniya came out and stopped when she saw the car positioned the way it was, door already open, no pretense of casualness about any of it. "Get in," Han Seok said, not the lazy version he used on Linden Street. This was different. Saniya looked at him for a moment, reading whatever it was his face was doing, and got in. They pulled into traffic, and he didn't explain and she didn't ask. The silence between them had developed its own texture over the past weeks, sometimes comfortable, sometimes loaded, but tonight it sat differently. Tighter. Han Seok's eyes moved to the mirrors with a frequency that told her everything she needed to know about why he was personally driving. She was processing that when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Sent Emmanuel's hospital. She answered immediately. Han Seok kept his eyes on the road and listened to one side of a conversation that lasted less than 2 minutes. He heard her voice stay steady and professional through all of it. Yes, she understood. Yes, she would find a way. Yes, she would call back by morning. And then she hung up and the steadiness simply ran out. She didn't make a sound. That was the thing that struck him most. No sharp intake of breath, no attempt to speak. She just turned her face to the window and went very still, and the quality of that stillness was the most devastating thing Han Seok had witnessed in a long time. Her hands were folded in her lap with the careful deliberateness of someone using every available resource just to hold their shape. Kane surgery slot. Deposit deadline, 48 hours. Han Seok drove. He didn't drive toward her neighborhood. He took the route to St. Emmanuel's without announcing it, and when Saniya realized where they were going, she turned from the window and looked at him but said nothing. He parked, got out, and walked inside like he had somewhere specific to be. She followed him to the billing desk. She watched him speak quietly to the administrator, watched him reach into his jacket, watched the administrator's expression shift through surprise into the particular professionalism of someone processing a transaction they would be talking about later. The whole thing took 4 minutes. Han Seok turned from the desk and walked back toward her. Saniya stood in the middle of the hospital corridor and could not find a single word in any of the languages she knew. She looked at him, really looked at him, with everything down, no posture, no armor, just her face completely open for the first time since the night they met. "Why?" she said. Han Seok looked back at her. She watched him reach for something, some polished response, some calculated answer, and come back empty. The silence stretched long enough to mean something. "I don't know," he said. They stayed at the hospital, sat in the waiting room side by side in plastic chairs under fluorescent lights, and talked in the unhurried way that only late nights and exhaustion allow. He told her things he didn't plan to tell her. She told him things she had never said out loud. The hours moved without either of them tracking them. By the time gray light began gathering at the windows, something had changed between them that neither of them could name, and neither of them could undo. Kane's surgery was scheduled for 7 in the morning. Saniya was there at 5. She sat in the waiting room with her hands clasped between her knees and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was refusing to let them finish what they had started. The room was mostly empty at that hour, a few other quiet, drawn faces in plastic chairs, all of them carrying the specific weight of people waiting on news that would determine everything. Saniya stared at a point on the floor and breathed carefully and did not let herself think past the next 5 minutes. She didn't hear him come in. She just became aware, gradually, of someone sitting down beside her, and when she turned her head, Han Seok was already settled in the chair, forearms resting on his knees, eyes forward. No bodyguards outside the door. No suit jacket. Just a dark shirt with the sleeves pushed up and the particular stillness of a man who had decided to be somewhere and meant it. He didn't say anything, neither did she. They sat like that for 3 hours. At some point, she couldn't have said exactly when her head found his shoulder. It happened the way things happen when the body is too tired to maintain the positions the mind insists on. She didn't correct it. He didn't move. The waiting room filled and emptied around them, and neither of them acknowledged the other's presence out loud, as if numbing it might disturb whatever this was. Then the surgeon appeared in the doorway. Saniya was on her feet before the man had finished his first sentence. The words, successful, stable, recovery, arrived in the right order and she understood them individually, but it was the combination that undid her completely. It came out of her quietly at first, and then all at once, the way things do when they have been held too long, and Han Seok stepped forward and put his arms around her. It was awkward for exactly 1 second, the stiffness of a man relearning a language his body had forgotten. Then something released in him, and he held her properly, one hand at the back of her head, and Saniya let herself be held without pulling away or shrinking or managing herself for his comfort. She found out about the full bill an hour later. A nurse mentioned it in passing while reviewing Kane's post-surgery paperwork. The account had been settled in full, no balance remaining. Saniya sat with that information for 3 minutes before she stood up and walked to the car park. Han Seok was leaning against the car like he had been expecting her. He probably had been. She opened her mouth, had an entire speech prepared, something about charity and pride, and the precise terms on which she was willing to accept help from anyone, including him. She looked at him, and it dissolved completely. He was just standing there, waiting, patient in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. "Why do you keep choosing me?" she asked. Han Seok pushed off the car and walked toward her slowly. He stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his gaze. "Because you're the only person that ever made me feel like I had to earn something." Saniya looked away, pressed her lips together, looked back. That evening when he pulled up outside her building, she reached for the door handle, and then, without planning it, closed her hand around his for just a moment. Warm and brief and entirely deliberate. Neither of them spoke. She went inside and leaned against her front door with her eyes closed, and her heart doing something unfamiliar and wonderful. A smile came without permission, slow and private, and completely unguarded. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number, one message. "You think the most dangerous man in the city chose you for love? Ask him why he really walked into that café that night." The smile faded. She stopped answering on a Tuesday. Han Seok called twice that evening, and both times the phone rang out. He told himself it meant nothing. She was tired. She was with Kane. She was busy. He called once more on Wednesday morning, and when it rang out again, he put his phone face down on the desk and sat with the specific discomfort of a man unaccustomed to uncertainty. By Thursday, he drove to the café. Saniya was working. She saw him come in, held his gaze for exactly 1 second, and looked away. She sent Talu to take his order. Han Seok sat at his usual table and watched her move through the room, attending to every customer except him with a thoroughness that was too deliberate to be anything other than intentional. He waited until the café thinned out, and then he simply stood in her path. She stopped, looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen in weeks, the old version, sealed and unreachable. "Who sent you a message?" he said, not a question. Something shifted in her face. "You know about it." "I know a rival crew has been watching you. I know they would use anything available to." "Did you plan it?" Her voice was low and completely even. "From the beginning, was any of it real, or was I just something to figure out and file away?" Han Seok went very still. He could have deflected, could have reframed it, redirected it, handled it the way he handled most conversations that moved toward territory he preferred to control. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and the absence of any performance in that small movement was its own kind of answer. "I came to that cafe to find your weakness," he said. "Yes," he kept his eyes on hers. "I bought the cafe to make you feel it. The first weeks, that was my ego, all of it." A pause. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Saniya said nothing. Her jaw was tight. "But everything after that night in the hospital waiting room," he leaned forward slightly, "that was never a game, and I need you to know the difference." The silence between them was long and without mercy. "I need space," she said finally. "Okay," he said, and he left. He did not come back. No calls, no car on Linden Street, no dark coffee order at the corner table. The cafe continued exactly as it always had, and somehow felt entirely wrong doing it. Tolu noticed. The regulars noticed in the vague way regulars notice when the atmosphere of a place adjusts. Saniya noticed most of all and said nothing about it to anyone. 6 days passed. On the 7th, at 5 minutes to closing, the cafe door opened. No bodyguards, no entrance, just Han Seok walking in quietly, crossing to the counter, and placing a single folded note beside the register before stepping back to the door. He stood there with his hands at his sides and waited. Saniya looked at the note for a moment before opening it. "I'm not here to conquer you, Saniya. I'm here to stay if you'll let me." She read it once, read it again, looked up at him standing at the door, no leverage, no power move, nothing to offer except exactly what the note said. She walked to him slowly, took his hand. They got married that Saturday at sunset. Kane stood on Saniya's left in a suit that Han Seok had arranged without telling her. Tolu cried before the ceremony started and blamed allergies. Kang stood at the back with his arms folded and the expression of a man deeply moved and deeply committed to concealing it. Saniya wore white, simple, clean, no adornment, and so entirely herself that Han Seok stopped moving for a full second when she walked toward him across the small courtyard. He recovered quickly. He was almost certain no one noticed the single tear that made it past his considerable defenses. He denied it categorically for the rest of the evening. Later, when the small reception had softened into warmth and laughter, Kang appeared at Han Seok's shoulder and congratulated him quietly. Then his voice dropped lower. "The streets are talking, boss. Some people aren't happy about this marriage." Han Seok looked across the room. Saniya was laughing at something Kane had said, head tilted back, completely unbothered, more at peace than he had ever seen her. Radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the dress and everything to do with finally being somewhere safe. Han Seok turned back to Kang with the particular stillness that had ended more than a few careers. Then they better learn to be. Time moved differently after the wedding. Not faster or slower, just differently, with more weight to the quiet moments, more intention in the ordinary ones. Han Seok noticed it first in himself, in the way he started structuring his days around things that had nothing to do with territory or leverage or the careful maintenance of fear. He noticed it in the calls he stopped taking, the meetings he restructured, the slow and deliberate way he began building walls between himself and the parts of his empire that had always required the most darkness to sustain. Saniya never asked him to. That was the thing he returned to most often when he thought about it. She had never issued an ultimatum or drawn a line or made his choices about her. She had simply lived her life with the same unbothered dignity she had always had, and Han Seok had looked at that life and decided he wanted to be worthy of standing inside it. Kane recovered fully by spring. He was studying by summer. enrolled in a program he had deferred twice during the worst years of his illness, funded by a scholarship that arrived under Saniya's name, so that when she found the letter she would feel pride before she felt anything else. She figured it out within a week, and confronted Han Seok in the kitchen with the letter in her hand and tears she was furious about in her eyes. He listened to the entire thing with his coffee cup raised, and when she finished he simply said she deserved to be the one who gave her brother his future. She didn't have a response to that. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope and kissed him once and walked away, and Han Seok stood in the kitchen for a moment feeling something he had no adequate word for. Saniya went back to the café. She had never really left, had taken only the minimum time away after the wedding before returning to her regulars and her routines, and the particular satisfaction of a job done well with her hands. Han Seok said nothing about it. Instead, on a Thursday when she was visiting Kane, contractors arrived at Café Noir and spent 11 days doing things Han Seok had planned carefully and quietly for months. New lighting, restored floors, the counter refinished in wood that actually deserved the room. When Saniya walked in the following Monday, she stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking. She called him. He answered on the second ring. "You did this." The counter needed work. She laughed, the full version, unguarded, and Han Seok sat in his office and listened to it like it was something worth memorizing. Their daughter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in late autumn, small and loud and entirely certain of her own importance from the first moment. They named her Nara, a name that belonged to both of them, that came from nowhere and everywhere, that sounded like something new being built from two very different kinds of rubble. Han Seok held her in the hospital corridor with the careful, terrified reverence of a man holding the most valuable thing he had ever been trusted with, and did not let go for a very long time. The months that followed were ordinary in all the ways that mattered most. Han Seok learned the school run, learned the particular patience required for small humans who needed 17 minutes to put on one shoe. The car that had once moved through the city like a warning now idled outside a nursery gate while he scrolled through building permits and waited. Saniya danced in the kitchen on Saturday mornings with Nara on her hip and the radio too loud, and the neighbors had long since stopped complaining because something about the sound of that particular joy made it difficult to be annoyed by. Kane babysat every Thursday. He had a whole system, snacks ranked by negotiation value, a playlist Nara approved, a very serious set of rules he had written down and laminated and pretended were not laminated whenever anyone brought it up. He was extraordinary with her and acted completely indifferent to this fact. Han Seok came home one evening to all three of them asleep on the living room floor, Nara between Kane's arm and a pile of picture books, Saniya with her head on a cushion that had migrated from the sofa, the television showing something none of them had been awake to finish. He stood in the doorway for a long time. The most feared man in the city, who had built an empire on the understanding that softness was a liability and warmth was a weapon other people used against you. Standing in a doorway in his own home, looking at his family on the floor, and feeling something so far outside the vocabulary of his former life that he had stopped trying to name it. He turned off the television, found blankets, sat on the sofa and watched them sleep until the room went completely quiet.